Hi, good morning, Vanessa. This here, Vivian and Ha. Thank you so much for joining us today and giving some time to learn more about yourself and getting to know your journey about the organizational behavior and the new book that you has published last year. So, would you please share with the audience a little bit about yourself?
Sure, yeah. So I am an experimental social psychologist, and I study social influence, but I study it in a kind of a different way than people typically study it. So for the most part, when people talk about studying social influence, they talk about ways to be more influential in one situation or another. So, they might talk about the way you can present an argument so that people are more willing, to go along with it, or, ways in which you can make a presentation that's more powerful and compelling. And those are all great tips, and they're very useful to lots of people. But when I look at influence, I actually look at all sorts of different types of influence. So not just those kind of formal times when you're really trying to convince someone or to change someone's mind, but all the little ways that we impact people every day, and the little times that we say something that sticks in someone's head and they recall it weeks later and we don't even realize that we had influenced them. And the other thing I do differently is, instead of kind of looking at the things that make someone more or less persuasive, I look at our intuitions. So what do we think about what would make us more or less persuasive? What do we think about whether someone is likely to remember something that we had to say? And what I found in my work and what I talk about in the book is that we tend to underestimate our influence in lots of different situations. And we actually have more of an impact on people all the time than we tend to realize.
That's great. Thanks for sharing us a bit about that. The next question is a bit of the curiosity. Why are you choosing the topic of influencing in the behavior? Yeah.
I was a psychology major as an undergrad, and I thought I was going to go into advertising. But when I went, I actually did go into advertising for a little bit. I had my first job out of college was in advertising, and I was in account management, and I kind of like I wasn't doing the things I would have thought I was doing. It was more like just a go between different areas of the ad agency, and between clients, and between, the creative people and everything. But I fell in love with one area of advertising, which was market research. And I found that fascinating, but everyone in that department had PhDs. And so I decided to go get my PhD in psychology, still kind of thinking I might, go back into advertising, right? And wasn't quite sure what I was going to do. I never thought I'd be a professor or be doing research as long as I have. And then early on, in one of my first years in graduate school, I was working with a professor there, Frank Flynn, at the business school at Columbia University in New York City, where I was. And I was running this study that we were working on, where I would go down to Penn Station in New York City, a big, train station hub, and go up to people and have to ask them to fill out surveys. And I did this day after day. I went up to people and I would say, "Hey, will you fill out a questionnaire?" And it was so painful to me. Like, I hated asking people for things. Um, and then when the study was done, I talked to Frank Flynn, the professor I was working with, and our original hypothesis didn't work out. And so I was kind of bummed that I had put all this like torturous effort into getting these surveys when it didn't work out. And I was kind of describing, I was just like, "Oh my gosh, this is awful." And Frank was looking at the data and he was like, "You're describing this terrible experience of asking people for things, but it looks like most people were actually agreeing to do the things you were asking. Like, the compliance rates are actually very high." And we decided then to sort of start exploring this question of the way influence feels in your head, and how you feel ineffective, and how you feel like, you know, people are annoyed at you. You feel like people aren't going to do things for you, and how it is in reality, and sort of comparing those two things. And so that's how we got started. And we started asking our participants to go influence people the same way I did, like to fill out questionnaires or do other things. And beforehand, we would ask them, like, what do you think's going to happen? Do you think people will say no? We got a sense of how they felt about it, and they all felt really anxious, and they were sure they would be rejected. And just like me, most people actually found that people were more likely to help them than they thought, or do things for them than they thought, and the experience was much less painful than they expected. And so that's kind of how I got started looking at this difference between what we think in our heads about influence and then what actually happens.
Vanessa, so from that experience, and then how did you come up to the idea of writing a book about influences?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, I had done these studies where people asked people to do things and they were more likely to do them than they thought. And I kind of had a sense that in general, we might underestimate our influence. But that was like a very specific kind of area. And as I went on, studying influence, I started to see trends in other areas as well where we might similarly underestimate our influence. So one of my colleagues, Erica Boothby, and I ran some studies where we had people give compliments and found that those were appreciated more than people tend to think, right? So people thought that giving someone a compliment wouldn't make them feel as good as it actually did. Erica Boothby also had some research showing that we think people are paying less attention to us than they actually are, and like us less than they actually do after we have a conversation with them. And I started to sort of realize how all those different pieces fit together with the research I had done on asking, and how it all kind of had a common theme of just not realizing how much we do impact people in the world and the people around us. And so once I sort of had all those different pieces, I felt like I had enough for a book. I also looked out at the landscape of sort of influence books, and there are so many books on influence. I mean, some of the most popular books out there are like How to Win Friends and Influence People, right? And Bob Cialdini has a book called Influence that's, been an amazing and popular book for many years. And so many of these books, though, are about just actual influence, like how to gain influence. And they're not about this idea that we have influence all the time, which I've seen in my studies, and we tend to underestimate it. And so I felt like there's a place out there for that maybe we gravitate towards all these books because of these psychological biases that make us underestimate the influence we already have, right? That we don't actually need a lot of these books.
How do we help the people to realize they are actually having the impact, influence on other people around them, though?
How do we help them? Yeah. So there's a few things I suggest in my book. So one is that one of the reasons that we underestimate our influence in different situations is just by nature of the fact that we look out through our own two eyes. And when we do that, we see everybody else and how they're impacting one another. And we see, how they're impacting us. But what we miss, because we're looking out through our own two eyes, is us, right? We don't see ourselves in scenes, and we don't see the ways in which we may be doing things or saying things that other people are reacting to, right? They're not just saying these things out of nowhere. They're actually reacting to things we're putting out there. And so one thing I suggest in the book is finding ways to get out of your own head to kind of be able to picture scenes from a third party perspective. So one researcher, Eli Finkel, a collaborator of mine, has shown that with couples, married couples, if they do a little writing exercise where they imagine a fight that they had recently from a third party perspective. So like imagine your friend watching you fight. And they do this kind of just for a little bit. They do this writing exercise 3 times a year, that in fact, their marital satisfaction stays higher than couples that don't do this kind of exercise. And so it's kind of a similar thing. Like if you can find ways to kind of practice through a writing exercise or just through mentalizing, like practice getting out of your own head and picturing scenes and how you're actually part of that too and contributing. That's one of the things I talk about in the book.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing that, Vanessa. I'm curious, how do we can pick, can see if somebody having higher influential skill than the other person? How can we measure that? How can Vivian have better, identify that Vivian has better impact on me or somebody else?
So if you were to compare, like, does she impact one person more than another person, you mean?
No, I mean in
But,
terms of her skills. How do we distinguish this person has more influence or capability than to the other person? Is that a way that we can see?
I think so. I'm not sure if this answers your question, but I'll try. So one of the things we do is we basically measure what someone thinks, the influence that they think they had, and then we ask the other person how much influence that person actually had on them. And so in that way, we can compare this disconnect between our impressions of kind of the influence that we had on somebody and the influence we actually had on somebody. So one of my favorite ways that this has been done is Erica Boothby's studies on something called the liking gap. And what she does is she has two people have a conversation. And then after the conversation, she asks each of them, how much do you think that other person enjoyed talking to you? How much do you think that other person liked you? And how much did you like the other person? How much did you enjoy talking to that other person? And what she finds is that both people say that they liked talking to the other person more than they think the other person liked talking to them. So we tend to be hard on ourselves. We tend to underestimate how much the other person liked us. And it's really a bias, right? Both people had a nice time, but in that sort of post-mortem where you're thinking about what happened, you're focused on all the ways that you feel like you messed up in the conversation, the ways, you weren't interesting enough, you didn't ask enough questions or whatever it is. And the other person's worried about all those same things. And actually both people wind up liking each other more than they thought and kind of being positively impacted by that conversation more than they realized.
Wow.
But Vanessa, you have some topic relating to underestimate and overestimate of saying yes or no. I think it's quite interesting about that. Would you share with us a little bit? Because in a normal conversation, like you mentioned, sometimes we underestimate in this situation and overestimate the other time. And saying yes and no, also we interpret differently. Yeah, from time to time. I saw you have some topic about that. Would you please share with us? Yeah.
Sure. So this goes back to some, sort of my story about being in Penn Station and asking people for things and how I was surprised that they were willing to agree. So since then, with other collaborators, I've had participants in my studies ask over 15,000 people different requests, and they guess how likely people are to say yes.
Uh-huh.
And what we find is that in face-to-face context where you're asking someone in person for something, and we've had them ask for all sorts of things from, surveys like I did in Penn Station to, can I borrow your phone to make a call? Will you sponsor me for a race and, donate money? Will you, show me where a difficult to find location is around here? All these different kinds of small sorts of requests. When you ask face to face, we find again and again that people underestimate how likely people are to say yes by about twice as much. So people are twice as likely to say yes than we think. The place where we overestimate, which is really interesting, is when it's not face to face. And so when we, for example, ask the same thing over email, we actually think people are going to be just as likely to say yes over email as if we walk down the hall and ask them in person. But in fact, they're far less likely to say yes over email. And we don't realize that. And so what that does is it actually results in us overestimating our influence over email and thinking that we're more likely to get a yes than we are. But in person, we underestimate our influence and we worry more about getting a no than is likely to happen.
I see. So in this new world, new normal of COVID situations, we work a lot with virtual, connection. So would we would we may follow that kind of pattern, or do you think people are kind of adjusting it over the time?
Yeah, it's a really important question right now, as you said. I'm not sure how much things have changed. We did run a study post-COVID, pretty recently in the past year, where we had people ask over email or Zoom or over the phone, and also guess how effective each of those ways of asking would be. And we found something similar where people really, they just thought it didn't matter how you ask. Email is the same as Zoom, is the same as the phone, right? Just like we found before, email is the same as in person. people are really thinking like if someone wants to do this thing, they'll just say yes, right? They're not thinking that it matters how you ask. But we actually found large differences between asking over email or over the phone or over Zoom. And what we found was that the phone and video calls were much more effective than email. So email is still just like a terrible way to ask. You know, you don't have that all the nonverbals you get from video and even from the phone. The phone was actually just as effective as a video call. And at the same time, you know, people can come up with the words to say no to you. They can take all the time they want. They could even avoid replying to the email altogether. And so it just is not a very effective way, but people don't seem to realize that. So even in like our current context where a lot of us can't be in person or ask for things in person, our research still shows that you want to ask in kind of a richer way, in a way that has more nonverbals. Picking up the phone, making a video call, those are both better options than email.
Vanessa, if influencing, right? What you said earlier, if I can change the perspective and try to look at the way that the other person is doing from their lens, and then eventually we increase our influence capability. What else in the core of the influencing? If I would want to be practicing and improve my skills in that area, what would be the core things that you think that I and the audience need to focus on?
Yeah. So, and one thing is that, you know, there's a lot of advice to take other people's perspective, as you noted. Even, you know, Dale Carnegie of How to Win Friends and Influence People says you should take people's perspective so that you can influence them. But actually, research has shown that that is not the best way to actually understand the influence you're having. Right. So if I try to take someone's perspective, I basically never get out of my own head. I'm kind of trying my best to figure out what they feel about something I said or whether they heard something I said, but I'm guessing, right? I'm still in my own head guessing. And my guess is going to be biased by what I hope to be true or by, you know, stereotypes I have of that person or ideas I have of what they're likely to have paid attention to. And so research actually shows that instead of trying to take someone's perspective, one way to become more aware of your influence is actually to ask people, right? To get out of your own head and try to get into their head. And so often we don't just ask someone, you know, what their take was on something we said or what they remember of something or what they think about something. And in fact, people are more willing to open up a lot of the times about things that we worry that they won't kind of share with us than we think. And so one way to understand your impact more is not to guess what people are thinking of the things that, you know, you've said and done, but actually ask them questions about what they remember from a presentation, what they took away from a conversation, for example. And then another one is just to practice and to sort of discover that you do have this influence. And there's several ways to do that. So one is just when you have something that you need that is worth asking someone for, to just ask for it. And often you'll find that people are more than happy to do things for you when it's, you know, a small favor, for example, or even sometimes a big favor. Another thing is asking people you wouldn't ordinarily ask. So we tend to think we have to ask our friends and family and people who are really close to us, but actually a wider range of people will often do things for us than we think. And then also, in addition to asking for things more, you know, offering more compliments, expressing our gratitude more, and kind of trying to impact people in a positive way more. And the more we practice these little instances of influence, asking, complimenting, you know, telling people the wonderful things that they've done that left an impression on us, we start to realize that those things are really meaningful, that we have a lot of power. And we start to recognize our influence through these kind of little ways of testing it, basically.
Wow. Thanks, Vanessa. A lot of my audience are business leaders, HR professionals, and then and then we've been seeing that they've been in big organization. Normally, conflicts happens, and then in the core of it, I believe that because of people don't know how to negotiate or the stakeholder management is an issue. So if business leaders wanna create a culture where promoting influence in the professional way? How can they create that environment, Vanessa?
Yeah, I think, one thing we talk a lot about in my negotiation class
Mm,
is coming at negotiations from a perspective that doesn't assume you and the other person's opinions or desires are in conflict necessarily, right? A lot of times they are, but there may be many things that are actually things that you can agree on, right? Things that you both want. And the more you
mm,
kind of focus on those, we talk about it as integrative solutions where you're expanding the pie and kind of finding areas of agreement. The more you can sort of assume, at least not assume that your interests and the other person's interests are totally in conflict, the more you can kind of go in and explore possibilities that might actually be positive for both parties. So I'd say if there are issues around conflict, it often is this perception that the pie is fixed, that we all need to fight over, the piece of the pie we're going to get, as opposed to thinking that actually maybe there's ways we can expand the pie where we can all benefit. So one of the classic examples we talk about in my negotiation class is, you may have heard this, the story of two sisters who both have a recipe they want to make, and it involves an orange, but there's only one orange left. And so they fight over it and they squabble and they both think that they each, deserve the orange, and they give all the reasons for it. And eventually they just split the orange down the middle and they each take half. And so one of them takes all the juice out of the orange and puts it in their recipe. The other uses the rind in her recipe for zest. And they realize after the fact that if they had gone into it with an integrative sort of way of thinking, they could have both gotten the whole orange, but the parts of the orange that they wanted. And so again, it's, because they went in with a mindset of, we have to divide up this orange in a way where, I get more, you get more, as opposed to, what are you going to use it for? Maybe there's a way that we could both get what we want with the resources that we have. And that if they had gone in with that sort of perspective, they could have both gotten the full amount of the orange that they needed.
Wow. Vanessa, you've been researching on the topic of influencing for a long time. So at the core personal level, I would want to ask, if we, the audience here, can increase our influence skill, what would be the benefit for us and individually?
Yeah, I think, being more aware of the influence that you have should help you kind of go for opportunities you might ordinarily hold back from, right? So that's one big thing, is lots of times we don't ask for things because we assume that there's no point, that someone would say no to us, right? That we're not going to get it. Or we kind of negotiate ourselves down before we actually ask someone else for something. We think there's no way they'll agree to this, so I'm going to ask for less, right? Less than what I actually need, or less than what I actually want in many cases. And so I think the more you sort of recognize that actually people may be more amenable to doing things for you, to saying yes, even to saying yes to bigger things than you tend to realize, the less we kind of underestimate ourselves and hold back and miss opportunities. The other piece that, I talk about in the book, which I also think is important, is this idea that also when we recognize the power we do have when we ask for things, we can be more aware of situations where we might unintentionally misuse it, right? Where we might be asking people to do things that they actually feel really uncomfortable with, and they feel uncomfortable saying no to us. And so once we kind of understand the power of the ask, right? Power of asking for things, then we can understand both of those perspectives, right? That I actually could get the things I really want more than I probably realize. At the same time, people may not feel as comfortable saying no to me for certain things as I realize. And that I could put people in awkward positions if I don't recognize that.
So it looks like that the ability to asking questions seems to be one of the fundamental things for anybody if they want to be building up their influence or capability. Am I correct?
I do think that's a big part of it. And, I think people associate things like help seeking, for example, as showing weakness, right? Like when I ask for help, I'm somehow showing that I'm vulnerable and I can't accomplish something myself. But that's actually a form of influence. It's really a form of getting what you need. And it turns out that people appreciate that. They're more likely to do things than we think. and they actually see that as a positive when we ask for things. So definitely asking for help, asking for advice is another big way to have impact. And as you mentioned, asking questions about, what are you thinking about this? Trying to get into other people's heads. All these things can help us sort of understand the influence that we have.
Wow. Thank you, Vanessa, very much for answering all of that. My last question for you is about what's next that you are doing. Is there any exciting project, anything new that you are doing that you can share with the audience here?
Sure. So a lot of my recent research is kind of focusing on that second half that I mentioned really briefly about how hard it is for people to say no to us. And trying to understand both how that can lead us to put people in awkward positions and kind of diving more into that idea, but also understanding how we can get better at saying no. I have a lot of people ask me questions about, it's really hard to say no. How can I get better at saying no? And I have some pieces of advice that I give, but I haven't tested them in my research. And so that's something I'm really looking forward to doing next, is kind of identifying ways to say no, right? So we talked so much about how you're more likely to get things than you want, so you should ask. But then if you're on the other side, being asked for things, right? How can you actually kind of deflect? And so that's kind of what I'm looking forward to doing next.
Thank you very much for sharing that. And we really, really appreciate that you're not saying no to us.
Glad that we did not assume.
Yeah. And Vanessa, you've been doing amazing works, and then we really appreciate what you do. And I think that all the sharing that you had tonight with me and the audience here, very appreciated. We wish you all the best, and I hope that one day your next book about how to say no, will come out, and then we will have another talks about that one, and then we pick your brain on that one. All right?
That sounds great. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you very much. Happy New Year to you. It's still New Year in this part of the world, so Happy New Year to you. Wishing you a wonderful 2022.
Thank you, and Happy New Year to you as well.
Okay, thank
you,
you.
Vanessa.
Bye bye, Vanessa. Thank you, Vivian.